Hello, Brad. How you doing?
Good. How are you doing today, Ken?
Pretty good. It's good
That's good.
to put real face to real name.
Yes. And hi, Jeff. How are you doing today?
Pretty good, thank you.
Well,
How
thank
about
you
you
very
guys?
much for presenting at the conference. And I'll let you both know when we have people entering the room.
So, Brad, did you have quite a number of students, I suppose, were signed on for this?
Yes, we have about 150 students signed on to the event, and that's through Lethbridge College. A few more, a few from the U of A, none from the U of L yet. And in total, we have 300 people registered for the conference.
Oh, that's pretty
The
good.
registrants. And Jeff, I believe I do have a question for you from the chat. And
Okay.
it states, what is the most used method used in Alberta to control ammonia losses?
I'm probably less familiar with what goes on in Alberta than I am in Saskatchewan, but I think probably the most effective method for controlling the ammonia losses, if you have a manure source that is susceptible to ammonia volatilization, is to get it into the ground and have that surface coverage of the manure by the soil. I think also some urease inhibitors can be effective in reducing volatilization losses in some cases, but certainly that old adage, get it in the ground and cover it up, really goes a long way to trapping that ammonia in the soil.
So now I get base time with Jeff Schoenau. That's always tough to do. Lined up in the office, Brad, at least 4 or 5 deep this time of the year. So everybody, all the students, wanted to get in to have a visit about their final year thesis project. How many did you do this year, Jeff? How many
My
students?
usual 8 of them. Yeah.
So it's usually and a good smearing of different topics, or what
Yeah,
was
they're mainly all the ones that they do in the summer. So in many cases on their own farms. So a lot of them are like the replicated strip trials.
right?
So you're kind of a little bit limited in what you can do there, but everything from micronutrients to fertilizer placement to, it's a good place to take a look at some of these new biologicals as
Oh
well,
yes,
just to see if
yeah,
they do anything or not. So yeah.
yeah. Well, there's a lot of different directions that folks are chasing with that. I was on another webinar this morning looking at talking about endophytes and the
Okay.
variety of so these are for Brad's purposes, endophytes are cohabitation organisms with roots, plant roots, and they live inside the root. So a normal endophyte is like the fungal endophyte, mycorrhizae, right? So
Oh, yeah.
arbuscule mycorrhizae is an endophyte. This guy was talking about a bunch of other bacterial endophytes, which kind of stretches people's imagination. I mean, they have a hard time imagining that there's a whole bunch of roots down there, let alone there's microbes inside the roots. But of course, there's microbes inside of everything, and fundamentally pretty important. But it's always interesting to look at. Okay.
And we do have Trevor Wallace joining the question period now.
Hi, Trevor.
Hey, Trevor. Everybody wants to talk to you because you're the only other guy there but Brad. We're sick
And I
of all
haven't
his
talked to you for a
questions.
long time either. We usually have a phone call once in a while.
And it appears Trevor doesn't have a mic on his computer.
Okay, so we can tell all the Trevor jokes we want. I don't know any.
You'll be signing in anyway.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, just give us a heads up of questions that you have, Trevor, by chat or however.
Yep. There. Did that fix it?
There we are. Yep.
Perfect. Sorry about that. How are you guys?
Good. How are you doing, man?
Doing well.
Good, good. Keeping alive. I don't know, living the dream. What can I say?
Yeah, yeah. Is lots of snow still in southern Alberta, or?
Well, Brad, we don't have that much up here.
No, that's
Really?
what I've heard. Yeah, yeah. It's even a little bit shy up there. Yeah.
Yeah, like I got, bare fields,
Yeah.
which is completely unheard of.
And there's no snow in southern Alberta either.
Okay.
There's a bit of residual snow up against buildings, but it's
Yeah.
mostly all gone.
There's actually snow in Central Butte, which is the first time in about 3 or 4 years. So I've been able to snowmobile for the first time around
Really?
the farm. It's been pretty good.
Oh, fantastic. Are you still there? Like, you doing classes remotely?
You bet. You bet. I'm sitting in a house I have in Central Butte rather than the farm because it's got high-speed internet. So it's worked well.
Okay.
But yeah, no, the university's closed.
Okay. Good.
So everything's remote.
Yeah, no, same things here. Most people are working from home with the department, but we'll see what happens next week when if anything changes on that. Work has been mostly remote, but it's been going well. We're still restructuring. Still don't know what we're going to be doing, if any, field work right now. We got a few projects, but nothing like what we used to. A lot of things went over to colleges or universities, so some different programs, but manure didn't go anywhere. We still have that. Apparently nobody wanted it.
Well, you guys are
So
so
we'll
good
see
at
what
it.
we get doing. Yes, that's why. They're so good at it.
There's just no way that could be moved or replaced at all. No.
No. I was quite excited in the presentation, and I'm looking forward to see it. The variability trial, the one that you have started with the new feedlot.
Oh yeah. No, that's worked out pretty well so far. I mean, we're really seeing benefit there from the precision application, and I think though a lot of it simply has to do with just staying out of the sloughs. And I mean, that's what we always tell people. I mean, you might not call that precision, but I think it is. And I think it'll go a long way to giving some impetus to people to say that, you really don't need to put that right through the center of that watershed. But, something that's kind of interesting, Trevor, that's just coming out of this year's data is that, we aren't seeing the yields out of our 2 manure zones compared to the commercial fertilizer. And I am thinking it might have something to do with lower availability of the manure phosphorus than what we're predicting.
Okay. Even lower than, yeah.
And I guess our soil assessments and our silage barley phosphorus uptake, when we get that data, will help maybe give us an answer to that. But yeah, it just seems like in this, particularly in this second year, there's something that's holding it back a little bit in those manured landscapes that's not in the commercial fertilizer. And the only difference we've got really is the phosphorus that we added in the commercial fertilizer that we haven't added at all in the manure treatments.
And I suppose you can't partway through go and put some strips in of phosphorus and see what happens.
Well, you kind of hate to do anything in those landscapes because we're looking at the phosphorus in the runoff that we're collecting in the basins.
Yeah.
So that would kind of bum it up, so to speak.
Well, it really suggests starting another one somewhere else and replicating that.
The funny thing was that with that we had about 5 years at Humboldt with swine manure and starter P versus no starter P sub plots in it, and we never saw a response to any phosphorus at all in those manured plots. Now that was 10 years ago. Older varieties, different conditions. Yeah, I don't know. The silage barley takes a lot out of the soil. There's no doubt about it when you harvest all that above ground material.
Yeah. Well, we've often talked about having some starter phosphorus just because of cool soils.
Yeah.
Wanting to seed on February 1st if we can. and I did like that variability trial, and just because we've often talked about that, trying to hit 75% of your nitrogen needs with manure or so, and topping up with fertilizer for the rest of it, only to deal with that variability piece from your other project there.
Oh yes,
How
yes,
it really nicely evened up.
Yeah. Yeah, that covered up a lot of sins.
Yeah, doesn't it?
When you, we got to get around to publishing that someday. I know I've talked about that stuff and talked about it, and I just got to get around to publishing. But so much emphasis now is on the greenhouse gas and the carbon storage component that so that always comes to the forefront. People, oh, we want to publish that, but this other stuff, yeah. I mean, from a practical standpoint, some of the variability stuff is I think valuable to get out there and have people think about.
There's probably other people here that want to ask questions instead of chit-chatting. I probably should stop talking.
We did have two members join, Karen Schmidt and Karen, did you have any questions for the group?
And I don't know, Jeff, if I mentioned this to you before, but some of the high-tech equipment being used for the application of solids, a company outside of Calgary, they spread around Strathmore, and they use, it's not so much variable rate, but their equipment is mapped on the field where it physically shuts off.
Yeah.
We're probably a ways away from our applicators, being able to afford that kind of high tech, but that just leads to where you can do variable rate where the machine's increasing or decreasing. I know we can do it with liquid manure with the pumps easy enough, and variable rate can happen across the landscape a lot easier, other than the shifting of a gears approach, is which generally what we use now.
Yeah, no, that variable rate spreader, that JBS unit worked very well. And when I didn't show any of the data, but like we truthed it with trays, and it basically came pretty close to doing what it was supposed to do according to the prescription. And they had just varied the rate as we went across there. There was no speed changes or anything. It was simply on the basis of the side of the end gate opening up and the rate of the conveyor movement, and it did a pretty good job. And it mapped it out, so you had a nice map in the end of what went on.
Yeah, I've seen it with the liquid, and they're either using constriction or just pump increases, and one of the applicators claims he can get within 200 gallons of whatever rate you want him to do.
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah.
Which is fantastic compared to how we used to do it.
Oh yeah. And we did those trials out at Tremonde Farm with an old worn out horizontal beater unit, and holy man, just the kind of variability. I bet you it was 100% CV.
Ken, you should be able to chime in on some of this as well. We shouldn't be ignoring you in this conversation.
Oh, I just it brings me back to the old days just to listen to Jeff talk. and that and the Humboldt work, Jeff, that was more than 15 years ago, because the first stuff, I was still there. I mean, that's 20 now at least.
Yeah.
But 25 maybe. One of the questions I did want to ask, and I don't know that much about it other than working with some hog manure guys in that Lethbridge, Fort Macleod area, but phosphorus in hog manure, has that been changing much over the years? Has pretty much stayed the same as far as phosphorus concentrations in manures?
I don't know if anybody's ever done any recent surveys of that. Trevor, have you guys in Alberta?
No, we haven't. No, nothing. IPNI would be the only one. If we've asked them before if they had any of the lab analysis from manure samples, and they've collected them once in a while, but not frequently. And we know less about them than they do the soil samples to be able to tell us, how it's changed. We've always expected it to change, and we've also always expected it to be in a less available form than it used to be.
And that's kind of what we've been seeing going out and looking at hog manure sites over time is definitely, it's changed some compared to dairy manure. Like dairy manure is still really pretty high P supplies coming out of liquid dairy, but hog is not the same.
You know, it
And-
never was that big an issue in our trials. We had not a bad N to P ratio in all of the manures, the liquid manures that we worked with from the swine barns, you know. And then I think some of them started to use phytate, and so they were able to keep some of the phosphorus supplements that they were adding down because of that. I don't know whether they've continued that on. Those phosphorus supplements aren't cheap. I know when phosphorus was really expensive, they were really cutting back. Now I don't know whether they cut back on the enzyme and started to increase their supplement use again as P prices dropped in the last few years. But
yeah, and I think you know, you may want to. That may be part of it, because we've definitely seen some you know, it's changed over time, and with phosphorus, less expectation that there's going to be a whole ton of phosphorus coming out of hog manure, the same as dairy manure. That's for sure. But yeah, interesting. I mean, the worlds of manure are definitely, you know, it's a resource that if you got it, you usually got too much of it. And when you don't got it, you need it, right? So, you know, sadly, it was one of those things that when, you know, farms changed, manure got to be a lot trickier. But preaching to the converted on all the manure parts.
That's true. The last time we looked at content, which has to be 5 to 7 years ago, we did it with Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And Manitoba actually did do a survey, primarily hog. And we looked at their numbers because theirs will be a lot newer than ours for hogs, because they have more hog barns. So you'd have to talk to Clay Sakow,
Okay.
or Petra Laura.
Oh yeah, I know Petra.
Yeah. They might be able to remember more so than I did. We compared our numbers, and our numbers weren't, the Manitoba numbers were slightly different. We thought they might be a little bit better than ours, so good. But generally speaking, we weren't that different with our book values. But then our book values are made up of a giant average anyways, so.
Yeah.
Trevor, I just had one comment, or there's still a few labs in Alberta that are doing, that are doing manure analysis, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like it is at least down to earth, and Exova was looking at getting back into it because they stopped, but they had hired some new salespeople that were looking back into it, and I don't know if they ever did. And then ALS up in Edmonton was still doing it, although I'm pretty sure they send their samples to Saskatoon.
No, ALS is not doing manure analysis anymore. Anywhere.
Oh, really?
Nope. So there's no manure analysis in Saskatchewan. We wanted to get a couple of samples run here. It was early in the spring last year, and yeah, we sent them to Alberta.
Oh, okay.
It's not something you want to get into, Ken?
No. It's everybody likes what they're doing right now, and manure digests are just they're just too exciting. So back to the past for me, it would be going into manure analysis. Although A&L or AL, a lot of samples, if they're submitted, if they're going to A&L labs, of course, that's all the way out to Ontario. But yeah, ALS in Saskatoon, it's kind of like getting up to pull teeth to do anything non-environmental, non-routine. I had some soil carbon stuff that was tricky to, basically you just got to keep paying until they decide that they want to do it for you. But that's okay.
Yeah, they moved back out of a lot of the material, the agricultural materials analysis, like compost and even plant samples for total elemental composition. So
good. Open to any other questions. We're just hanging out here for the next while. Jeff and I go way back, so we've talked about all the old stuff before anybody came on. Not quite didn't quite hit all the skidooing questions, because the sledding now in Central Butte and in Saskatoon is very good. it's actually pretty good snow covers. I know that the rest of the Western Canada is not, or well, Southern Alberta is definitely not.
Hey, Brad, Jack Payne here.
Hi, Jack. How are you doing today?
Good. I got not so much a question, but maybe just a question comment for Jeff. Actually, very timely, your presentation. I was working through a bunch of about 40 fields on some fertilizer recommendations this morning, and some of the fields had been manured. Some extremely high phosphorus, some extremely high potassium levels, and almost to the point, well over 1,200, 1,500 pounds per acre. Just wondering, Jeff, when you see levels like that, is that maybe due to the, like you were saying, uneven distribution or uneven spread of manure? And I guess a soil test like that, where we're getting 1,500 pounds of potassium showing up on the report, how accurate, if that's a composite sample, what degree of variability are we dealing with?
Yeah, there's no doubt there's some hot spots out there. You really have to be careful when you're out there. They're taking cores, and you need lots of cores, and invariably, as you know, probably you're going to end up with a non-normal distribution. So you're not really sure whether that sample in the end really represents the average in the field anyway, Jack. But yeah, we see the same thing. And in our long-term trials that we had at Dixon with cattle manure for 15 years, yeah, you could see the phosphorus ramping up there at the high rate application rate, and also the potassium as well. I guess we also looked at in some of those soils one time the tetany ratio in the plant material that was growing on there, and then related that back to some fairly high potassium to calcium and magnesium ratios in those manured soils. So something to watch out for, especially if you're growing forage on those manured soils, is that high potassium relative to calcium and magnesium in the soil can translate into some high potassium relative to calcium and magnesium in the forage. And, then you may be running into some issues there with potential tetany or milk fever in dairy cattle.
Just to build on that then, Jeff, what levels, if you're seeing some wonky levels on a soil test with potassium, where would you be throwing some red flags then as to where there may be some issues then?
Yeah, I would want to look at ratios of potassium to calcium and magnesium. And I'd have to look back. We published a paper on it in the Canadian Journal of Soil Science a long time ago, and I can't remember what we actually established as a kind of a critical criterion for those relative availabilities of those ions. But also sometimes it depends on the manure source, not only the potassium, but you're also adding some calcium and magnesium. So sometimes the problem isn't as bad or maybe as severe as what you might expect. But even a simple cation exchange composition analysis could be revealing in looking at that and see if there is a problem with an excess of K relative to the other base cations. And what would be interesting too, Jack, is to take a look at the sodium as well.
Right. Okay.
That was always a concern. Manures, a lot of them do contain fairly high contents of sodium, especially the liquid manures, and the salts in there. And there's always a bit of a concern about in a poorly drained soil that those salts are just going to be adding to a salinity problem that already exists, and no ability to flush those salts out.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff.
You bet. Good to talk to you, Jack.
So back to the question of ratios, Jeff, and Jack, if you're still listening, actually just taking the part per million potassium, calcium, magnesium, and calculate the potassium absorption ratio. That's a really good place to start. So just like a sodium absorption ratio, you can calculate the potassium absorption ratio, and my rule of thumb on the manures would be anything above 3, a potassium absorption ratio above 3, and you're going to want to start looking into trying to balance this out more more base cations, calcium magnesium would be helpful. Just from what we had been seeing on the PAR, or potassium absorption ratio. You can just stick it into Google and you'll come right up to how to find out how to do that.
So do you see that
I
on
know.
manured soils?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, guys. I was just going to make a comment, Ken. I know I'd one time talking to Tom Jensen, he'd run into a situation where they had a field that was heavily manured and potassium was overloaded and getting to the point, yeah, where it was messing up ratios. And yeah, it was, I just remember he was almost talking about that they were going to have to try and balance some of the other base cations because he said it was extreme, but I don't remember what the levels were at.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all, everything's relative when it comes to cations for sure. And, you know, so just, you know, running that Gapon equation, which is like an SAR calculation, but with potassium instead of sodium, you can actually come up with a exchange percentage or absorption ratio, potassium absorption ratio predicted on the clays. And that's actually, if you're short of a full cation exchange, you know, test, that will give you a pretty good idea. And yeah, I'd be concerned if there's anything kind of, you know, 3 to 5, you're starting to actually get to be, I'd be thinking about, you know, worrying at that point. Lower than that, not a problem likely, until you get down to like less than 1.
Do you see that, Ken? Do you see that on your manured fields that you receive quite consistently, or once in a while you see high K supply rates relative to calcium and mag?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, but it depends. Like, so one of the places where we saw that was dairy barn, where they were milking, and the liquid was going out one direction, but the yard scrape was going out another direction. And because, of course, potassium coming out of the cow was all liquid, where all the liquid went, way overloaded in K, and where the barn scrape went, they were actually low, and or low-ish, right, when they were silaging. So that, I mean, you can definitely pick up the differences of even in the manure world. It's not all the same, and that's interesting to see. I mean, it's a pretty novel situation because there's not a lot of people, you know, milking, so it's not like widespread like beef cattle manure or feedlot manure. But yeah, we done, you know, mostly the sodium is less of a concern, I'd have to say, Jeff, as far as the worrying about a high sodium buildup. But I mean, we haven't seen it in anything yet around Lethbridge, which, you know, you start to think about that's where you're going to see it if you see it first, but not so far.
Ken, I got a question for you.
Okay. I love your background.
Hi, Christina.
Thanks.
I haven't seen you for a while. But yeah, it's good to see you.
There you go. I'm in the middle of the field right now, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm about to start a PhD project this year, and one of my projects is going to be looking at crop modeling.
Yes.
And I just noticed in your kind of crop caster type tool, can you give me any insight as to maybe some of the crop modeling that's maybe behind some of that? Oh
yeah, for sure. So so going back to my beginnings in the world of crop modeling was actually with the now pretty much used tool called DaySat, which actually at one time was the Century model, which goes back to development at the University of Saskatchewan. So I worked a lot with that model, worked with a bunch of other simulations, like NTRM, which is a good one, the nitrogen tillage residue management. That one is now out of print, I think, or maybe it's stuck into some other models. Did some work with AppSim. So AppSim, of course, is pretty popular in the research. To took apart some of the pieces of EPIC, which is now another model that USDA has, more watershed and embedded. But my favorite, and this comes back to actually work that Jeff and I did early, where we were looking at initially at soil erosion and trying to figure out how do you predict the impact of soil erosion, because different, you know, it's definitely dependent on soil properties, but you need it to have some better yield predictor than, you know, you lose topsoil and you lose yield. So we published papers on that, and I can send a couple to you that in the Canadian Journal of Soil Science. Myself and Eric Bremer actually in the last loop around. And what we developed there, Christina, are basically think about constrained resources. So I mentioned that in my talk. You know, there's resource constraints that control how much yield potential there is, and there's different kind of levels that you can look at this from the lowest level of you know, build it up like Ecosys does at the University of Alberta. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but that's a beast, building up all the knowledge. Or you can kind of go to the higher level and work down, and that's what we did with these constrained resource equations. So I point you to an older paper. I'll actually find it and I'll put it in the chat here in a minute, that we published in the Canadian Journal of Soil Science. Eric Bremer and myself, Malcolm Black, a few other people, Lawrence Townley Smith. And it kind of goes through the theory of how we develop constrained resource equations. And then the Cropcaster is definitely the kind of sum total of that, with the Barber model, the Barber flux model, basically plugged in the bottom to try and figure out what nutrients we're doing. So, you know, most of, like any good farm boy, I went out to the junk pile and cut up a bunch of things and put them back together in the shop, which has quite been very successful. And as you likely had seen in my kind of video description of, you know, granddad versus today, you can kind of play a bunch of these what ifs very quickly. And that's what growers want to do with a simulation model. It's not necessarily what a scientist wants to do with a simulation model, because you're trying out different knowledge, right? You're trying out in the science world, you want to see if this is important, if it actually adds. So one other kind of simulation space that I would say is a good, that's not relevant to nutrients or plant growth necessarily, but definitely in the space of winter survivability and winter crop acclimation. I've published just recently with Brian Fowler kind of his end of career sum total of knowledge about how winter crops are working to acclimate, and how you can use basically his career to play around with what winter crops would be adapted, which is, trust me, way more fun than reading his book. Because, you know, and my personal opinion is going forward, we will have a lot more of these, you know, simulation tools that are parts and pieces actually make a lot of sense to bring to Alberta and use, or and then there's other parts and pieces like, you know, some of the people trying to use AppSim, which is an Australian model, in Iowa. Doesn't make much sense, because the core concept behind AppSim is to calculate water limited yield. So it's all about you're short of water, and Iowa 9 times out of 10 is low yield because of excess water, not short water. In fact, if you think about it, they're usually working on the over wetness side, and that's why they tile all over, right? So
well, they developed that water logging module as part of their APSIM model as well. And I guess that's my interest actually, is in the APSIM model, even despite, I know it's on the water limiting, but from a crop phenology point of view, you know, a lot of it's built for canola already. So if you can have a bit of that risk management tool built with some limiting parameters in there, that might be of interest anyway.
Absolutely. So the bottom line with any of the functional kind of knowledge that's inside of it, you always want to, you know, try it out to see if the pieces that are spinning, the gears that are moving, are really valid in your region. And that's where sometimes I knew it, well, in a lot of the models, not so much in the Australian ones, but definitely a lot of the Southern US models, they had big constraints built in because of things like pH and aluminum and iron oxide chemistry affecting phosphorus, which, you know, in the soils we have are just, it doesn't mean anything. So there's a lot of heavy lifting that the model is doing that really doesn't add to the knowledge. But APSIM is definitely, you know, well published. And yes. I mean, it's a nitrogen and water model. So there's two things in it. Big upside with what we're looking at is literally every nutrient is going to be considered, right? So not just the nitrogen, but phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and then everything balanced to make yield. Anyhow, I'll send you the constrained resource paper. That's handy.
Okay,
actually beautiful. Just over here. Great, thanks for the question.
Thanks for the info.
Yeah, no worries.
That's it, Brad.
Well, if anyone has any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to send it to my email, which is found on the site. And I'll get those questions forwarded to Ken or Jeff and get a response sent back to you. But thank you very much for presenting today, Jeff and Ken. Really appreciate your presentations. They were terrific.
Great.
No worries.
Thanks,
it was great.
Enjoyable.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate it, Brad. Great job.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thank you. Hopefully for next conference, we can meet in person.
Well, it's great to see everybody's faces anyway. That's great. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
I just sent it to the feed loop
Okay.
chat. So I don't know if you're still on the feed loop chat. I could put it into this chat as well.
Sure, if you want to do that, then I can just grab it out of there.
Absolutely. So it's just that link. If you follow that link, you'll get right to click the link right from there. You'll open a web browser and find the paper. So yeah, it's another way of looking at decisions, I guess, in a more aggregated sense. I mean, less mechanistic, but more functional. And you know, if you need more, get a hold of me and we can definitely talk. I've got lots of opinions about the Australians and lots of papers about them too. So that you know, one of the very first times they used APSIM to do a what if scenario with a grower, they wrote in a paper that it took them 35 minutes to set up the other what if. So I think Cropcaster beats them in that respect, where you can just slide the button, right? So, and those are I mean, when it comes down to I want to use it as a scientist, there's definitely reasons to have a different tool than I want to use it as a grower. And one other, I'll send you the other link as well if you want to get a hold of me by email or whatever to the work on winter cropping. It's also interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, winter survival. Yeah, cool. Okay.
Appreciate it,
Thanks,
Ken.
guys. We'll see y'all later. Have fun out in that canola field. We'll let those bins blow over on you.
I don't think those ones are going anywhere.
Yeah. Some of them moved. Boy, Western Canada, southern Saskatchewan really took a beating. Just literally a beating. I've not seen anything like that forever. Broke records. And, yeah. Anyhow.
Weather extremes. Yep.
Yeah, it's you definitely understand that the variance is much more worrisome than the average changing. Okay. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
See you later, Brad.
Yep. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
And if anyone has any follow-up questions, you can just send those to my email, bcalder@warnercounty.ca, and I'll get those forwarded to Jeff or Ken, respectively. Thank you very much for attending the session today.